Hello, Professor Matthew. My name is Gabriel O'Connell, and I'm a student in your Global Management Concepts class. And this is my presentation for Project 4, um, the Cultural Dimensions Country Comparison Project. And so the nations that I decided to compare for my project are the United States, which is where I'm from, and Norway. So here we go. There we go. Okay, so for my introduction, so the US and Norway are two countries with totally different histories, geographies, population sizes. The US is significantly larger at around 337 million people, compared to Norway's 6 million-ish people. So the US is a significantly larger nation. But uh, despite this, the US actually has a lower per capita GDP than Norway. And the numbers there are, for comparison, are $51,749 for the US and 99,558 for Norway. So although the US has a substantially larger total GDP, per capita, Norway wins out, almost twice as much. And so Norway's growth has been relatively recent. The discovery of oil in 1969 on land really transformed Norway. And ever since then, they've been growing rapidly. And an interesting fact about this is Norway is actually one of the countries adopting electric vehicles the quickest, with the lowest carbon footprints, but much of their economy is built on selling oil to other nations. So it's kind of ironic there. Anyways, comparing the US and Norway provides us with evidence that multinational corporations can and should manage across cultures and adapt based on the culture that they're in. So power distance is the first of our 6 dimensions that we're going to be examining today. This deals with the fact that all individuals in society are not equal, and it basically expresses the attitude of the difference in authority and power. So how I relate to my superiors, basically. And so the US scores 40 on power distance, and this can be seen by the convenience-based hierarchical systems and the accessibility of superiors. And I've seen this in my own life. My superiors where I work are very accessible. We do weekly touch points, and they regularly ask me what I think, and they ask me for my feedback. And Norway is very similar in this regard. Power is decentralized, and managers count on the experience of their team members. So both countries are very similar in power distance, but they are not nearly as similar in individualism. And individualism is concerned with the degree of interdependence a society maintains among its members. And so the United States is actually one of the highest scoring countries in the world with a score of 91 out of 100. So it's a lot. And this is seen, the society is loosely knit, and the expectation is that people look after themselves and their immediate families, and not to rely too much on authority figures and the government, really. And whereas Norway, on the other hand, with a score of 69, is individualist, but not nearly as much as the United States. Self is very important in the US, and I think this is really expressed in pretty much everything. I certainly see it in my own life. I've ever since I was little, I've always wanted to express my individualism in different ways, and so it's definitely a value that we have in the US, and it multinational corporations should pivot and adjust according to that. Masculinity is the next area where the US and Norway are very different. And according to Hofstede, masculinity refers to what motivates people. Is it wanting to be the best, masculine, or liking what you do, feminine? And so in the US, masculinity definitely reigns supreme, with a score of 62. And this can be seen in the typical American behavioral patterns. Again, I see this in my own life. I tend to be a bit of a driver, sometimes to a fault. I'm very, very competitive and, typically want to be the best, even if the person I'm comparing myself to is myself, as odd as that may sound. Sometimes I get overly competitive, but this is an important way in which multinational corporations and companies really need to pivot to meet the demands of consumers. Norway, on the other hand, scores 8, and is thus the second most feminine society, just after Sweden. We have a pastor on staff at our church who's from Sweden, and I sent him that and to explain what masculine and feminine meant in this context. But this means that the softer aspects of culture are valued and encouraged, such as leveling with others, consensus, independent cooperation, and sympathy for the underdog. We definitely don't have quite as much of that in the United States. Uncertainty avoidance is our next area that we're going to focus in on. And this has to do with how a society addresses the unknowns of the future. And so the United States scores below most with a score of 46, which basically means that there is a hunger for innovative ideas, and there's a willingness to step outside of the comfort zone and try new things. Norway is, just above the US, but right at 50. And so not really much of a preference there. Both nations are, pretty close to the middle. I think in my life personally, I tend to probably be low on this. I generally like trying new things, but I know a lot of fellow Americans who kind of sway toward both sides. So long-term orientation is the next dimension that we're going to be looking at. And this has to do with how every society maintains some links with its own past while dealing with the challenges of the present and the future. So both the United States and Norway are very low at this. The US has 26 out of 100, Norway has 35. And so both nations are what we call normative as opposed to pragmatic, which means that we typically prefer to maintain time-honored traditions and norms while viewing societal change with suspicion. And so, this can even go back to uncertainty avoidance. There may not necessarily be a fondness for change right away. And there's definitely, I see this all the time where I live, especially in Louisiana, in the deep South in the US. There is a fondness to sticking towards tradition. So both nations share that. And the final dimension that we're going to examine today is indulgence. Indulgence examines the extent to which people try to control their desires and impulses. And both nations score relatively high on this. The United States definitely edges Norway up a bit, and it is an indulgent culture, which basically means that the average person in the US has a relatively weak control over their impulses. Norway is a bit more inconclusive, a bit higher than the average there, but definitely a bit more inconclusive. And so this is super important for MNCs, and they definitely use it to their advantage. An American marketing kind of focusing in on cravings, impulses, that impulse buy, let me hit you with this advertisement. And so some implications from these 6 dimensions. So, obviously for 4 out of 6 of those, both nations are very similar. The 2 exceptions would be individualism and masculinity. And I think the biggest takeaways that I can really see here is when doing business with someone in the United States, or if you're, executive or head marketing person in an MNC and you're advertising to consumers in the US, then it is significantly more advantageous for you to make those that you're advertising to feel like they are winning as an individual. So that's targeting that desire, that drive to win, and also that deep-seated desire to be an individual. Norway, on the other hand, it would matter a lot more to make a person feel like their actions are helping support the greater good, right? So it's not as much appealing to this competitive driving nature, but it's more so appealing to larger scale, bigger picture. How is me purchasing this from this company going to benefit a lot more people in the long run than just myself? And so those, obviously, just that idea in and of itself, there's so many different ways in which that can be seen in advertisement and marketing, and just doing business with people in both countries. But I definitely learned a lot doing this project. These are my references. I really enjoyed it. I would love to go to Norway, even just looking at the pictures that I used in the slideshow, although the US is beautiful as well. And so thank you so much, Professor Matthew. Hope you have a wonderful day.